Good morning. I echo Bill's words, how good it is to be back in God's house worshiping with you all, and we're most grateful for this beautiful day. I want to mention before begin the message that my wife Kristen and daughter Ren are not here today. Ren has come down with a nasty virus, sore throat and all that sort of stuff. So one, because she's not feeling well, and secondly, because they don't want you not to feel well. They have stayed away today, but they send their regrets and love. Would you pray with me, please? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. As we clearly saw, a hurricane is not something to mess with. It's definitely not something to ignore as though you could. Hurricane Florence was not being ignored in our state and elsewhere as it lumbered along, dumping massive amounts of rain and causing levels of flooding that one government agency official called biblical. Now, whether or not that's a bit exaggerated, this storm has brought an incredible amount of water and destruction to the coastal counties of North and South Carolina and well inland, including here to Charlotte. As many of you, I'm sure, I was watching the weather news on TV 2 weeks ago as Hurricane Florence was crossing the Atlantic and approaching our coast. My concern was heightened by the fact that my mother and sister live in the northeastern corner of the state, very close to the coastline. For a number of days, I didn't know if I were going to have to hop in the car and retrieve them from that area. As it turned out, because the storm went so far south, my mother and daughter were mother and sister rather, were better off staying where they were and doing nothing. They got no rain, which is amazing. Probably the only place in the state that didn't get rain, which was remarkable. But it's not always the case to do nothing as being the better course of action. I'm dealing with a storm of another kind involving my mother. Many of you know that she is not well. I was with her this week when she was hospitalized. She was discharged quickly from the hospital and is home now, but there are all sorts of challenges with that situation that I'm trying my best to deal with in person and from a distance. Her decline has been precipitous. Like a hurricane moving inexorably across the Atlantic, we know what looms on the horizon unless the storm changes course. My family and I are doing our best to prepare for it, but there's only so much you can do when the storm is moving your way. In anticipation of Hurricane Florence, government officials and TV news people had been adamant about the need for preparing for that storm. And one of the best ways for those on the coast was to evacuate, particularly in the area of Wilmington, but north and south of that as well. Folks inland were also warned of the impending flooding as the storm was slow-moving and, as you know, would cause more damage by the water it dumped on our state than by the winds that would blow on the shoreline. Those winds were not insignificant, though, even though the storm dropped from a Category 4 when it was out in the Atlantic down to a Category 1 when it hit the coast. A week ago, Friday morning, I was watching the TV news, and on ABC, Amy Rohrbach, I think that's her name, around 8 o'clock, while standing in Wilmington just after the hurricane had made landfall, said strongly, no one should be outside. No one. Of course, she was saying those words as she was standing outside. Actually, she was in a parking garage, but it was open, and that was right after David Muir had given his report standing outside, getting absolutely soaked in the blistering water and rain and so forth. I always appreciate their efforts, but you got to wonder when their advice is so contrary to their actions. Now, some folks are there because they have to be, such as rescue workers, and thank God for them and their commitment to their call. Debbie and Terry Britt, I believe, were telling me this morning about their son on the coast, and we are grateful for those who literally put their lives at risk to save others. I learned of a group that I didn't know about on the news called the United Cajun Navy. Maybe they grew out of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, but The United Cajun Navy is a bunch of guys with boats who go to the hurricanes as they come in with the aim of rescuing those who might suddenly find themselves stranded by rising waters. And they came here, thank God, and hundreds of people, particularly in the New Bern area, I believe, were in need of such rescuing after the storm hit because the water indeed rose so very quickly. And these men brought them to safety. We're grateful that they're there. There are other persons, however, whose presence in a hurricane zone makes little or no sense. Some are thrill seekers who want to prove to themselves or others that they can ride out the storm. It seems like every time we have a hurricane, they're interviewing some guy who's standing there at the hotel, no one else around, but he's going to stay right there facing the hurricane. Others are just, I think, a little stubborn or slow to respond or whatever it is. They don't make the effort to pick up and leave. And I know in many cases economics play a role. There are folks who don't believe they can afford the cost of a hotel or who don't have family or friends they can go to who might be able to receive them. And for those people, we give our great sympathy, and it's very sad. Others, however, leave you scratching your head. One fellow named George was interviewed as the storm hit, and he said that when the hurricane was downgraded to a Category 2, he decided he didn't need to evacuate anymore. That despite the fact that for days the news people had been saying, don't let the category level of this storm deceive you, because it's not the winds that are going to be the problem, it's the rain. It's the rain. It's slow moving, and it's going to dump a lot of rain, which is exactly what it did. But people like George decided they didn't need to pay attention to the warnings, and there are people always like that who failed to do so. There's the story about a fellow in Louisiana who was a pillar of his church, and he had complete faith in God, and he lived down by a large river, but one night there was a lot of rain and there was a great flood, and the water rose to his knees inside his house. And some men, I guess they were like those United Cajun Navy guys, they came by in a boat to rescue him, but he refused to get in the boat. "Oh no, I have faith in God that God will rescue me," he said. Well, the water kept rising, and before long the fellow had to climb up on his roof to avoid drowning, and after a while some more men came in another boat to rescue him, but again he refused. "I have faith that God will rescue me," he told them. Some hours later, the water had risen so high that he was up to his neck. A helicopter flew overhead, saw him, and lowered a rope ladder down to him, but the man waved up at them and shouted, "I have faith that God will rescue me." Finally, the water was too much for the house, and it collapsed beneath the man, and he drowned. And he went to heaven, and he appeared before God, and he said, "Oh God, I had such faith in you, and yet you let me drown. Why?" "What do you mean, let you drown? I sent you 2 boats and a helicopter, didn't I?" I've never had a sermon that is more apropos for that joke. And it's interesting how the lectionary tied in. When we were planning it, we were stunned by the text from Proverbs. And here the storm was on its way. It's amazing how the lectionary so often speaks to the times in which we find ourselves. I'll tell you another little fact. One of the commentaries I was studying, what really surprised me, we debated in our meeting when we were talking about whether or not to go in that direction with that passage, the Proverbs passage. And I studied one commentary, and lo and behold, guess who the commentator was among 3 others? Bishop Ken Carter, and he wrote it while he was the pastor of this church. So I thought, well, if that isn't a sign that I should go with that text. The book of Proverbs, if you're familiar with it, is part of wisdom literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, our Old Testament. And Job and Ecclesiastes are also wisdom books. They're connected with wise men or sages who, along with priests and prophets, played a major role in the life of ancient Israel. The wise men were often asked to advise the king. Much of the book of Proverbs has traditionally been attributed to the great wise King Solomon. But he's not the author of all of it. Proverbs are mostly pithy, practical words for the wise, concise do's and don'ts for healthy living, especially the section of the book beginning with chapter 10. Lazy hands make a man poor, but diligent hands bring wealth. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Gray hair is a crown of splendor. It is attained by a righteous life. I have to confess that I shamelessly threw that one in there to score points with a lot of the congregation. I guess I'm following Proverbs 29:5. Whoever flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his feet. The first 9 chapters of Proverbs, including today's scripture, are different in that they convey truths through the personification of wisdom. Wisdom is female in the book of Proverbs, which about half of you right now, or probably more than half of you, are saying, well, of course. So is folly, by the way, the other personification in the book, just to let you know. I guess I've just squandered that flattery that I was spreading out as a net. So today's reading from chapter 1 begins with this statement. Wisdom cries out in the street. In the squares, she raises her voice. At the busiest corner, she cries out. At the entrance of the city gates, she speaks. So what is that telling us? What's the hidden message in there about that context? That wisdom isn't quietly and secretly talking to just a few special people, those in the know, over in a corner somewhere. No, wisdom is crying out in the public squares. She's the town crier and wants everyone everywhere to hear what she has to say. It's so important that everyone listen and respond. She's like the governor, the FEMA director, the mayor, and the local sheriff all rolled into one, imploring us to evacuate the coast because the hurricane is on its way. She's standing in the city center, shouting out loud. And while she wants everyone to hear her, she does seem to be directing her message to a particular group of persons. It's not a group you want to be in, but it's likely we might find ourselves there now and then. How long, O simple ones, will you love being simple? How long will scoffers delight in their scoffing and fools hate knowledge? Wisdom is chastising those who hear her words of life but ignore them, who think they know it all, but they don't, of course, who may even listen to wisdom but refuse to change in any meaningful way, who are foolish, in other words. In this depiction, wisdom isn't some esoteric concept only a few learned minds can grasp. No, it's something open and obvious, shouting at us in the midst of every aspect of life so that we can all easily hear it and benefit from it. If only we would take heed, if we would obey, in other words. But too often we haven't. We're like those individuals who hear the warnings about the hurricane but ignore them, or the man who's eschewing the boats and the helicopter. The message is clear, but they don't do anything in response. Get away from the coast, they're told, but they don't move. Wisdom is portrayed rather harshly, though, in this text. Did you notice that? Wisdom is laughing at the calamity that overcomes the fools who ignore what wisdom offers, mocking them when panic strikes like a storm and calamity comes like a whirlwind. Why so harsh? Well, I suppose it may be because when one ignores and shows disdain for what wisdom teaches again and again, eventually one suffers the consequences. Wisdom's laughing at the individual is a graphic way of saying, at some point, this is going to catch up with you. And then wisdom won't be shouting to you anymore to change your ways because you'll be getting what you deserve by your own action. There's nothing more to do at that point but to scorn the foolishness of the person with this self-inflicted wound. It's not so much Schadenfreude, that German concept of taking pleasure in another's troubles, as it is just shaking one's head in puzzlement and maybe even grinning that persons would be so foolish as to ignore the clear and sound wisdom put before them. Surely they should know better because the knowledge was given to them repeatedly. One wonders, however, to what extent wisdom is shaking her head at us, laughing at our calamity in this country with the various storms striking us. I'm not talking about hurricanes, of course, but rather the many other metaphorical storms that are blowing across our nation and our world. Racism, gun violence, intolerance, polarizing politics and attitudes. widespread generational poverty in the wealthiest nation on earth. The list goes on of ways in which we seem to be ignoring the voice of wisdom today. And of course, the voice of the wisest of all, Jesus Christ, isn't heeded by so many persons, especially in Western industrial nations, including ours, perhaps because we've become too comfortable and failed to perceive our need for the teachings and example of the one who says to love God and one another. That's the message that the Christ gives us. And now calamity is coming like a whirlwind, along with distress and anguish, just as the author of Proverbs says. We've too often turned our back on wisdom, choosing not to heed her warnings given to us in the street and in the town squares and at the busiest corners of life. She has cried out to us again and again to accept her teaching, but we've refused. We've refused. Something has to change for our nation and the world and for us as individuals. While it's fair to say that in the middle of the struggles of life, things are not always as clear as they are after the fact, eventually they do come into focus. And at that point, we should see the truths before us and change as a result. Those who chose to ignore the warnings about Hurricane Florence and stayed in their homes when they could have left gained clarity. When the water suddenly rose to dangerous levels, just as forecast, that's when they reached out to be rescued. That's when their minds changed. That's when they heeded wisdom, but it was too late and they were in the midst of the storm. Anne Lamott, a gritty Christian writer from the West Coast, found herself in the midst of a storm. When distress and anguish had come upon her, she was a mess. She was a mess. Alcohol, drugs, illicit sex, suicidal, grieving her father's death, these were the bands of hurricane winds blowing violently through her life. She writes about being in that storm. Then one afternoon in my dark bedroom, the cracks webbed all the way through me. I believed that I would die soon from a fall or an overdose. I knew there was an afterlife, but felt that the odds of my living long enough to get into heaven were almost nil. They couldn't possibly take you in the shape I was in. I could no longer imagine how God could love me. That's being low. That's being it, really, in a storm. Anne Lamott eventually did make her way to an Episcopal priest who counseled her and got her thinking differently. Wisdom was finally getting through to her, but gradually. She started feeling better, but it would be 4 years before she was sober. I was not willing to give up a life of shame without a fight, she would write. After another storm struck, and she was at the end of her rope, she had a real encounter with the one who calms those storms. A real encounter. She says that in her bedroom one night, she became aware of someone with her in the dark and hunkered down in the corner, whom she assumed to be her late father, whose presence she felt now and then. The feeling was so powerful, she wrote, that she turned on the light for a second just to make sure no one was there. Of course, she saw nobody. But she said that after a while, in the dark again, I knew beyond any doubt that it was Jesus. That it was Jesus. And she was appalled. She was appalled about what her quote-unquote brilliant, hilarious, progressive friends would think if she became a Christian. She did not want that to happen. So she turned to the wall and said out loud, "I would rather die. Hurricane winds are blowing, but I would rather die than change." That's what she and so many people think as they turn their backs on wisdom. Lamott writes about how after that she felt as though she were being followed everywhere, as by a little cat. Always wanted her to pick it up or open the door for it and let it into her life. She knew what would happen if she did, however. If you let a cat in and give it some milk, it'll stay forever. 1 week later, she returned to church. See, she had been going to church regularly, but only for the music. She never stayed for the sermons, but this time she did. I'm not recommending that, by the way, just It occurred to me as the words went out of my mouth. This may be counterproductive. This time she stayed for the sermon, and her review of it was as follows. She thought it was ridiculous, like someone trying to convince her of the existence of extraterrestrials. I'll let you be the judge of today's message. There was something, though, about the final hymn that she said was so deep and raw and pure that she could not escape. I felt like their voices or something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me like a scared kid. And I opened up to that feeling, and it washed over me. Washed over me. She continues as follows. I began to cry, and I left before the benediction, and I raced home, and I felt the little cat running along at my heels. And I walked down the dock past dozens of potted flowers under a sky as blue as one of God's own dreams, and opened the door to my houseboat, and I stood there a minute, and I hung my head and said, I quit. I quit. I took a long, deep breath and said out loud, all right, you can come in. So this was my beautiful moment of conversion, Anne writes. In the midst of the storms in her life, in the middle of all the calamity that had come upon her like a whirlwind, Anne Lamott finally turned and listened to wisdom. She finally opened her mind and her heart to the one who can calm such storms and bring us peace. She finally allowed Jesus to come in. So where are you this morning? Where are you this morning? Are you standing in the storm? Are the hurricane winds blowing you here and there because you've ignored the words of wisdom and failed to go to higher ground? The storms will come and go. God bless you. The storms will come and go. It's up to us to choose where and how we secure ourselves before they strike. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.